We're on to our fifth event of HES Week, and some of you have been at every event. So thank you. And to those of you who are joining us, thank you for being with us. You are in for a very important, timely, and urgent conversation on Asian American mental health. And then tomorrow at 11 a.m., right here in the Tanger, we have our keynote, the conclusion of HES Week. Professor Russell M. Young, our HES Scholar in Residence this year, will be delivering his HES Memorial Lecture, taking a look at Asian American history of resistance, mobilization, and the lessons for us in these times. So be here tomorrow at 11. Okay. Just a couple of quick announcements. If you're a student and you did not sign in on the way in, make sure you sign in on the way out. Also, we are recording this event. It's actually being live streamed on the Wolf Institute YouTube channel, and our recording will be housed on the YouTube channel as well. And that is all that I have, because you didn't come to hear me talk. You came to hear this wonderful, amazing scholars talk. So I am going to introduce my colleague from the Department of Psychology, Erica Niwa, to lead us in conversation. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. Can you all hear me okay? Yes, okay. My 13-year-old tells me I have a very loud voice, so even without a microphone, my voice will carry. We're really excited to have you here today. The title of this panel is Struggling, Surviving, Thriving, Asian American Mental Health. So what we're gonna do today is we're gonna go right down the line. First, Dr. Chair will be speaking, and each person will speak for about 10 minutes about their work. And then we'll come back together afterwards. I'll pose a few organizing questions and some thoughts about the conversation that has been started. And then after that, we'll open it up for any questions that you all might have for this really wonderful panel. So are you ready to get started? Sure. I would love to introduce Carissa Chia. She's a professor of psychology and Asian studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And let us know when you're. I'm going to shift over so that my head is not in the way. Let me just, here, I'll scooch over.
Sorry, can everyone hear me, or do I need to on the back? Okay, great. So my sincere thanks for the opportunity to participate on this panel and in the HES Week celebrations, and congratulations again to Dr. Russell Zhuang on his appointment as a HES Scholar in Residence. And thank you also to Dr. Gaston Alonso and the Brooklyn College for your very warm welcome and hospitality. So during the COVID-19 pandemic, my graduate students and I wanted to understand the experiences of Chinese American families with children 4 to 18 years of age. Specifically, we examined parents and adolescents' direct experiences with racial discrimination, as well as acts that they witness being directed at others of the same race or ethnicity, so vicarious discrimination. In addition, we measured if these experiences happen in person or online, and so together we were able to capture 4 types of racial discrimination. We found that during the early parts of the pandemic, 50% of parents and youth reported being directly targeted by COVID-19 related discrimination in person and then online as well, separately. And over 75% of parents and youth reported vicarious discrimination in person and online. We also captured parents and adolescents' perceptions of xenophobia, as illustrated here by one parent in our study. Because of this pandemic, there has been anti-Chinese sentiment in our society, and child discrimination may happen in the future. If this is the case, what I worry about is not only discrimination against my child, but something greater at the societal level. If these anti-Chinese sentiment gives rise to the rejection of all Chinese people, then he will definitely be affected more or less. If our entire society holds these attitudes, then it is a spark that will cause an explosion of anti-Chinese racist incidences. So over 50% of parents and over 70% of youth reported that xenophobia in the media and xenophobia, particularly around health, because it was COVID, was an issue in society, in American society. Finally, we also assess parents and adolescents' worries and fears about the government's racist actions, as noted by this parent. Several political leaders scapegoated China or ethnic Chinese people for COVID-19. They perpetuated public distrust towards Chinese individuals as dangerous and as, the whole Chinese society is bad or attacking the US. This experience of living through the pandemic has caused me to be much more aware of being Chinese and how it has affected me. We found that all of these different forms of experiences with racism and discrimination were associated with higher levels of reported generalized anxiety and depressive symptoms in parents, and with higher levels of anxiety and internalizing problems in youth. Youth were particularly vulnerable to vicarious racial discrimination and to xenophobia. Importantly, parents' own experiences of racial victimization was associated with their adolescents' self-reported rates of anxiety and internalizing problems, indicating a spillover effect. So whether or not youth knew that their parents were being discriminated against, they were being impacted as well. Unfortunately, we found that the rates of experiencing at least one form of racial discrimination increased from 2020 to 2023 for parents, although it did decrease in the last year for youth. However, the negative effects of these experiences on their mental health continued and even became greater over time, implying some kind of cumulative effect over time of these experiences and concerns and worries. As developmental scientists, we were particularly interested in how families were surviving or responding to their experiences. I'm not sure. Oops, sorry. And so we focus on their racial ethnic socialization, which is the transmission of information from adults to children regarding race and ethnicity. There are two general areas. One is ethnic socialization, which is the transmission of parents' ethnic and cultural values, knowledge, and traditions. And then racial socialization, which is teaching children about the meaning of being a member of a racial group, passing on attitudes regarding within group and intergroup relationships and interactions, and preparing their children for racial challenges and discrimination. These 7 specific types of strategies have been studied in Asian Americans before. However, we also saw that during COVID, parents were having another kind of conversation with their children. In the interest of trying to protect their children from these experiences of discrimination, some parents were encouraging their children to conceal their Asian or Chinese heritage or connection. For example, we'll look at the one on the bottom. This parent said, I said that in case your school classmate wants to ask, you don't need to say whether you're Chinese or not. And we saw also parents telling the school system that they didn't want attention brought onto these issues because they were afraid that would make their children become victimized again. When we looked at these different rates, the different rates of these different types of strategies that parents were engaging in, as well as their associations with child mental health difficulties, we found that there were some developmental and gender differences. But what was consistent was that the maintenance of heritage culture, so those passing on of cultural values and cultural pluralism, promotion of cultural pluralism, was linked to fewer child mental health difficulties at all child ages. In contrast, messages around awareness of potential discrimination that the child may encounter, avoidance of outgroups, and that new concealing Chinese heritage or Chinese culture connection practices and messages were linked to greater child difficulty at all ages. So we were also interested during this period that had made the feelings of identity or sense of identity, belongingness, and social political participation highly salient for Asian American youth. So we broadened our scope of study to examine the development of civic engagement in Chinese, Korean, and Filipinx American adolescents. In particular, we're really interested in how racial experiences, family socialization, and identity processes interact with each other to shape their civic engagement. What we found was that unfortunately, racial discrimination experiences discourage civic participation. So the more experiences of discrimination they had, the less likely they were to engage civically. However, we also identified some protective factors. 3 protective factors in particular. One was having a positive and central sense of your ethnic identity, so having positive feelings about your ethnic identity. The second was having parents who engage in this cultural socialization while being very competent at talking about race. And then finally, having parents who engage in conversations around politics, social issues, and civic engagement. These 3 factors were not only protective against the negative effects of discrimination on civic engagement, but they also acted as catalysts to help children transform these negative experiences into opportunities to engage socio-politically and actively. Finally, we were also interested in qualitatively exploring how families talk to each other by observing the interactive, dyadic nature of racial and civic socialization happening within families. So many Asian parents in the United States may be first-generation immigrants and have less familiarity with the racial and political landscape in the US. And so they may experience structural, linguistic, and cultural barriers towards participation. Their children may act as social political brokers. So you may have heard of cultural brokers or language brokers, but a lot of these children will also explaining these concepts and the political landscape to their parents and actively contributing to their own socialization process and engaging in what we call upward socialization of their parents. So I don't think we have time for a video, but I'll give you a quote instead, where here we see a 17-year-old boy saying, Asian people don't automatically just spread COVID. Could you see Donald Trump saying that? He basically called it the China virus and everything. The mother said, yeah, I would call it the China virus too. I truly believe it originated from there. And the child pushed back. It's like, it's not just that. I think Donald Trump said China virus as in like we should all view Chinese people with suspicion. So he was, in this case, engaging in socialization of his parents. And I'll leave you with a quote from a 13-year-old. We're often more active on social media and stuff. We could make more change in an internet space which isn't done as effectively by older adults. I think it's really important to have the younger generation speak up. We're not clueless about this stuff, so why can't we change stuff? Why can't we be active in it? So why can't we indeed? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Next, we're going to have Cindy Liu, who is an associate professor of pediatrics and psychiatry at Harvard Medical School, who will now be sharing some of her work.
Hi, everyone. It's really amazing to be here. Thank you to the Wolf Institute, Gaston and Kiana for organizing this Russell Jung fan club. I'm a longtime member. Yes, we should probably come up with a name. You know how like Taylor Swift has Swifties? We could be like the Russellites. I don't know. We'll come up with a name later on. Yeah. But thank you, Carissa, for just getting us started. And you're going to hear me reinforce a number of her findings and also speak a little bit more to some of the clinical implications. And then I'll also try to make this argument that this is cheesy, but I kind of like it, that stopping Asian hate is important for everyone's sake. Yeah? I will make that argument because I do think it has implications for public health. Russell writes in this chapter, The Tao of Adversity, for those who didn't experience the hate directly, they felt it vicariously. When they witnessed elders attacked or workers shot, they could easily see that the victims could have been their family members or themselves. And what Russell and Stop API Hate did was document all the different direct experiences of discrimination. And it allowed all of us to bear witness to what had happened. And so publicly we got to see, there were lawn signs that said "Stop API Hate" in my neighborhood. Never did I think that we would see lawn signs about the Asian experience. And so documentation of this was so critical for us to be aware. On the other hand, when you bear witness, there may be a cost to bearing witness, right? Is that we are seeing and vicariously experiencing the discrimination. I'll go back and say, Russell also says, it's weird to quote you, by the way, while you're sitting here, but I will state, share what you wrote here. Each time I read a Stop API Hate incident, I shrink from another paper cut of racism. And so there have been a number of studies, including Carissa's work, that have documented the pandemic racism and its impacts to mental health. One thing I wanted to point out is sort of, well, what is the mental health that we're referring to? We can talk about depression, but we can talk about anxiety as well. And this has been brought up, trauma, right? And we know about PTSD, stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. And the interesting thing about getting a diagnosis for PTSD, it's really one of the only conditions for which you need to have an event. And it has to be being exposed to potential death, serious injury, sexual violence. And manifestations of the disorder includes intrusive memories, avoidance, negative mood, hypervigilance. And not everybody who's exposed to trauma gets PTSD. I want to just be, clear about that. It's about a third, roughly. So that's PTSD. But what is race-based traumatic stress? It's something that people often talk about, but what is it? And it's very similar to PTSD, but it's not a diagnosis or a condition. What it is it's the event has to be related to race, which in and of itself is really interesting. If you think about it, how do you know if it's race-based? Nonetheless, the symptoms are overlapping. You get the hypervigilance, the avoidance of racist or potentially racist situations, intrusions, negative cognition. So very similar types of symptoms that you might experience. And so vicarious discrimination is associated with race-based traumatic stress. First of all, I'll mention that similar to Carissa's findings, we see that there's a lot of witnessing of trauma, but it's other people's trauma that you're witnessing, right? And so in a large sample of about 64,000 students, this is an analysis done by one of our undergrads. What she found was that 2/3 of Asians actually reported this witnessing, and that group, Asians, were more likely to witness discrimination. And not only that, similar to Carissa's findings, it's the vicarious discrimination. In addition to these other forms of discrimination, the direct discrimination, the vicarious also contributes over and beyond to the race-based traumatic stress. We have more converging evidence. So Tahami here published in Psychological Trauma in a smaller sample of Asian Americans, the same link, vicarious discrimination is associated with race-based stress, with social media actually being a mechanism for that witnessing. And then my postdoc, Alice, did a scoping review and found that of all the 51 studies that she found, the large majority found it in that direction, right? So there is this accumulated evidence of this link. Again, underscoring the importance of really thinking about vicarious discrimination itself as being something that's important for us to consider. So if we're witnessing trauma that's happening to other people, you're going to be thinking, well, it could happen to me. And so that sense of needing to protect yourself, protect your neighbors, protect your family members, you're going to start to surveillance your area and your surroundings. Similar to folks who have PTSD, they start to be hypervigilant and they scan for their environment for continued threats. And so that self-protection, is that good or is that bad? Right, if we're watching, seeing things on the news and we're realizing this could happen to me, is that good or is that bad in terms of your everyday behavior? What's really interesting is that proactive coping, which sounds like a really good thing, coping stress in the moment might be good. But on the other hand, what we see is that if you don't encounter direct stress every day, but you're proactively coping, you're more likely to experience race-based stress. And so this is, this finding is a simple one. It's an interaction, but nonetheless important because the question that we might ask is, could someone who encountered low levels of direct discrimination be primed for hypervigilance by witnessing discrimination, whether it's the news or in the social media? And so I said I would make an argument about the broader public health impacts. And we had a piece in American Journal of Public Health where we advanced this idea that, safety, not only is safety important, but that sense of safety. And actually we called it SAS, sense of assurance, safety, and security. We're arguing that SAS is an overlooked determinant of mental health. And the question is, the point is, the absence of threat is not the felt security, right? How do we actually become safe objectively, and also how can we perceive that safety? And so we think about these societal shifts, whether it's gun violence or racism or just not feeling connected with their community. Has that eroded population level of SAS? We do know that Asian American elders report more loneliness from social isolation, and they've altered their activities because of hate. Carissa showed some really cool findings on preparation for bias, that it lowers racial trauma if you have parents who help to socialize you. What's interesting in our data, and it's a little different from Carissa's, is that we also found among young adults that if their parents focused a lot about cultivating their heritage, that actually was associated with higher levels of racial trauma. We can unpack that later, but I think it's a really interesting finding. Is it good? Is it bad? We're not really sure. Now, this is our latest work. The question is, if the system fails, if there's no place for you to feel safe, and maybe culturally it's really hard to actually go to a therapist and disclose this information, where might it be safe? Well, now we're in the age of AI, right? And so we wondered, might Asian Americans be turning to AI? And we've gathered a number of different data sets to allow us to investigate this. And all of the findings seem to be aligned with Asian Americans are not only using AI for general purposes, more so than other groups, but they're actually turning to AI for their mental health. So you'll see these bar graphs here that Asian Americans are 6 times more likely to trust AI more than a human counselor for mental health. Other findings from other data sets are showing, again, just Asian students are using it more for mental health relative to other groups, even after you control for whether or not they're using AI in general, for looking up things and learning. They trust AI for mental health decisions more than their peers. They're using AI for companionship, right? So using Replica or Character AI and having relationships with AI, we're also starting to see some trends in that direction too. And so in taking both the traumatic stress that I've shared and then also the cultural and systemic factors that limit help seeking, like stigma, model minority myth, and just not having a lot of culturally competent providers, I'm raising this question as to whether or not this might be driving Asian Americans towards non-human sources of social support. This data is not yet published. We've only published a commentary that came out this past Monday in JAMA Pediatrics, articulating the fact that we do think that AI is altering the way that people are thinking about themselves, but I think we might speculate that it's altering their relationships too. And so I'm gonna leave it at that, which is, I think, all of the different technologies that are available, that may also be playing a role in how Asians are supporting themselves in the absence of what might be supportive in sort of in traditional forms. So 3 messages: the scope of harm extends far beyond direct targets. The boundary between coping and hypervigilance, we really need to think more about how do you actually cope in ways that are healthy. And then when traditional systems fail, could AI be filling the gap? And how do we ensure that help seeking can be safe? So with that, I'll stop. Thank you very much.
Certainly not least, of course, our Hess Scholar in Residence, Russell Jung, will be speaking. He's, of course, a professor of Asian American Studies at San Francisco State and a co-founder of Faculty. Thank you so much.
So thank you, Professor Chia and Professor Liu, for your presentations. Thanks for joining us this week. their findings are really powerful and really significant. And I just want to highlight some of their points for our conversation, and for all of you, you should start thinking too of what questions you would have, because they're not AI, so you could talk to real people about your mental health issues. One of Professor Chia's first points is that there were different types of discrimination during the pandemic, right? So you had millions of cases of direct interpersonal violence. And so if half of the Asian American community experienced, that's 12 million cases of hate. That was on one of their charts. But significantly, they found that vicarious racism was just as impactful, just as traumatizing. So maybe that's because of our collective nature, but we just don't worry about ourselves. When we see someone who looks like ourselves, who looks like our grandmother, then we feel it too, right? And so that's the spillover effect of vicarious racism. Just because someone else harmed doesn't mean that person only is harmed. When that person's harmed, I'm harmed as well. And that sense of interdependence, that sense of collective empathy is a strength of the Asian American community, but it harmed us during the pandemic. Professor Chia also talked about institutional and then governmental racism as well. And so anti-Asian hate wasn't just one prejudiced individual against another prejudiced individual. It's whole institutions. American society, our American president was attacking the Asian American community. And so then what happens then is if we experience all these levels of racism with that spillover effect, if it's not just me who's being harmed, but my family's being harmed, then that's why we argue that it was a period of collective racial trauma. And there's just episodes of historic collective racial trauma, but for Asian Americans, the pandemic clearly was one. It was collective because, again, we experienced that spillover effect. It was racial because not only Chinese felt it, but you could be Filipino and feel it. You could be South Asian and experience. Latinos were being punched and told, go back to China because they looked Asian. So it was racial, and it was clearly traumatizing. As you could see, it's not the same as PTSD, but we had the same experiences of anxiety, of depression, of hypervigilance, of avoidance of places. So sadly, like we were talking about, Professor Liu quoted me, but I had to read all those reports of racism, right? And so if we experienced vicarious racism, and I'm reading all the reports, I was getting paper cut all the time, so I'm just sort of this beat up person who had to read all these stories. So it was really difficult for me to have to go through all that. And so as I experienced that racism, then I began to wonder, wow, how is this collective racial trauma impacting our community? How are we feeling it? And then how do we respond well? And I'm not a mental health expert, but I play one in video interviews. And so I thought, having a Western sense of mental health, that, if you're traumatized, then you go see a therapist and then you get healed, right? And that's sort of the typical way I think, I don't know. But if we're dealing with racial trauma, how can you ever get healed when you experience racism on a daily basis, right? You keep on, the scars keep on getting, or the scabs keep on getting ripped off because you think you're healed from racial trauma, but then another experience, or you see something else on media, or you learn about our history and you realize, wow, our lives are about racial trauma. It's the day-to-day experience. And so how do we protect ourselves? How do we heal from it? How do we grow from it? And I think what we could talk about later is that you don't have to necessarily go through therapy or seek AI for help. But our communities have other ways of collective care that have been resilient for centuries. It's not like we're the first people who experienced trauma, Like We've gone through millennia of war, of poverty, of starvation. So there must be some wisdom that our ancestors have for us in dealing with adversity and in dealing with trauma. And so I think not only can we use AI well, not only can we learn to individually cope well, but I'm going to argue that there were specifically Asian ways of responding to trauma that were really helpful, that were useful, that have been studied to be evidence-based, effective in buffering us against anxiety and depression. I won't tell you about it now, but I would encourage students to realize that a lot of us experience collective racial trauma, but it's not the first time. But we do have community resources and cultural wealth from our families and from our ancestors of how to deal with it. And I encourage all of you, you saw all those studies cited. If you ever need to read a research paper in psychology, you could deal with this issue because there's now been a lot written about how racism affects our mental health, but not only how we've been impacted negatively, but how we've been growing from it. And so there's a notion called post-traumatic growth that we all experience trauma. You may not get healed from it, but then how do you grow from it? And I think that's a real good way to approach it, of how can we grow from the adversity we experience, and we continue to experience in this period of mass deportation. So we could talk about that. Thanks.
Thank you. Come join each other up here. I've been madly taking notes as you were all speaking. First and foremost, I just want to thank, I know a number of you, I could hear little sounds and people moving, and I was turning and watching people nod while you all were speaking. So I just wanted to thank you all so much for having this meaningful and really important conversation about the mental health realities that many of us face within AAPI communities. And I think one of the things that's that overlays a lot of the different work that you all are hearing about today is this interplay, right, between the deeply personal, lived, embodied realities of how discrimination and racism hurts, right? How it lives under the skin, how it is in the air that we breathe, how we move through it, while also thinking about the broader structural, socio-historical, institutional forces that come to give meaning, shape, consequences, value to the ways that we kind of experience that kind of racism. And particularly that how certain moments, punctuations in time, right, that begin to, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, begin to really make us have to face what are not new experiences for Asians and Asian Americans in the United States. My high school daughter is in the middle of doing a research project on the Japanese internment camps. These are histories and stories that many have been told many times for our communities, but also for many other communities who have been othered in the United States and through these kind of broader processes. The first thing I wanted to uplift, though, is all three of you spoke in, first, Russell, I really appreciated, you kept using the word collective. You said collective empathy, collective trauma, collective care, collective healing. And so one of the things I'm going to ask for us to think about here, and in your questions as well, is to think about what do we, all of us are asking up here questions of, so now what? What do we do next? So how is this something that becomes our joint responsibility? So when I think of collectivity, I think also of solidarity, right? How do we think about this in the context of broader history, stories, et cetera? The other thing that I really heard in a lot of your talks, and I'd love to hear any of you speak about, is the particular challenges that face Asian Americans as we live both in ways that are invisible, right, and hypervisible. So what it means to live in those spaces. The question around AI may start to question, right, where are spaces that we might move through where we feel invisible, spaces where we're speaking about elders not feeling comfortable even being out in spaces, right? What does that look like? So I was just curious how you think we might particularly address work, science, practice, whatever it may be, about with Asian Americans, particularly as we think about being on that in that space of being both hyper, very seen, and feeling like we're not seen. And anybody's welcome to go.
I'll start. I think you captured it really well. Part of the struggle or the experience of being Asian American is this concept of invisibility, and this concept of invisibility has been used very much, to in relation to being the model minority, for instance, characterized as being non-problematic, quiet, we're hardworking, we keep our head down, and we don't create trouble. But first of all, that's false, but it also perpetuates this idea that we then cannot speak up when, or should not, or cannot speak up when we should, when there are issues of clear inequities. And that harms also cross-racial solidarity, which, so this space of being hidden and invisible, and in some of our data, we saw this very, a lot of parents, very easily also turn to this idea of concealing their identity. But if you think about it, how do you conceal your racial identity? Or, we look a certain way for most of us, and telling a child to hide that part of themselves that they cannot, undermines their sense of, ethnic and racial identity, which we know has, all these positive benefits as well. And so I think that also passes on, messages that are really damaging, for children. And that's what we saw in our data. We have also longitudinal data that show that the negative effects get greater over time. There is this cumulative effect as well. So I'm gonna stop there. Yeah.
I guess, invisibility and visibility often gets talked about in the context of identity, and then we're also talking about in the context of mental health. And what I think is, I don't have an answer for this, but what I do wonder about is, first of all, Asian Americans are not a monolith. So there's a lot of variation in terms of what one should do, what one should lean in and, be more visible or be more invisible, under what context, situations, and so forth. So I think we just want to, remind folks to think that there's not sort of one way of thinking about this. And I don't speak for all of Asian Americans, right? But what I do have wondered about with respect to thinking about like help seeking and getting resources that you might need to support yourself and to support others is, I'm still grappling with this, is the extent to which self-disclosure is important, because not disclosing has been helpful for some, right? Because you just have to carry on and make do. And you immigrate, and yes, there are these traumas, and you just gotta like get through and survive. And that has worked for some people, and they'll vouch for that is the strategy. And then for many others, especially in the newer generation, where we might have the terminology, we can say racial trauma and know what that means. We have definitions for it. That self-disclosure, because we have that language, that is the mechanism by which we can actually overcome. And so it's hard, because I do think that everyone is at a different place in their sort of journey of being aware of what they need and how to describe it. Acknowledging that for some folks it's just maybe an earlier generation that's just very different for this generation. But that being said, again, collectively, what can we do to support all members of the community who might have different feelings about this? So this is something that I kind of struggle with, because I just don't think one size fits all.
Yeah, I'm going to respond to the collective nature of what we're talking about again. And I said there were some ways that psychologists have found Asians have been protected from the traumatic stress. And one is this notion of critical consciousness. And critical consciousness has two aspects. The first is that, some Asians, what they do is they experience a hate incident, people act meanly towards them. And if you're isolated, you just think, what did I do wrong? And there's a lot of self-blame, right? It's like, and what do I need to do to fit in better so I won't get attacked? And that's sort of like that hide yourself approach to dealing with racism. But with critical consciousness, you begin to become aware that the racism you may have experienced has ideological factors, structural reasons of racism, that it's not about you, it's about the problems that other people have about you. So that's the first part, just being aware of where racism comes from and whose problem it is. And then the second thing about critical consciousness is that knowing that maybe the source of the problem is the government, then you take action. And you try to address the government invisibility of your community, or you protest. And by taking action, then you go from self-blame to self-empowerment, and you work on a collective level, so you realize you're not alone in this, and you're working not just for yourself, but you're working with others in solidarity to make a difference. And instead of then learning helplessness, you get a sense of empowerment that you can take action. And even if you can't change the world, you're still taking a step of agency and growth and solidarity that really helps you, right? So critical consciousness has been found really important. That's why Professor Chia talked about civic engagement and why she studied the impact of racism on civic engagement. Because if Asian Americans could collectively be less invisible, but really stand up, then it would be actually good for our mental health to make that change. So that's just one of the ways research has shown how Asian Americans have responded to the collective racial trauma. And that's our encouragement for you, is don't suffer alone, but understand maybe if you're feeling troubled, that maybe why do other people face the same adversity, and then what can we do collectively to address the shared issues that we face.
I just want to add quickly, so we have data to support what you said. Critical consciousness. Critical consciousness is associated with greater civic engagement. Okay, that's not surprising, but it's also associated with better mental health 1 year later in adolescence. So critical consciousness.
This is actually a beautiful transition. So I was going to pose one more question to this wonderful group and then open it up to whoever else has questions. In our research lab, we often talk, we draw in many different folks from lots of different disciplines. And one of the thinkers who we've talked and thought about a lot is Ruth Wilson Gilmore, she's a geographer, prison scholar. But she talks about, she's talking about prisons, but she talks about the human condition, the human experience as well. She says, freedom is a place, and we make it, and we make it, and we make it. So my question is about how we make it. I mean that for all of you. I mean that for the rest of us out here as students, as scholars, as thinkers, as daughters and sisters and people just in our communities. When Stop AAPI Hate began, the actual documentation, I know you described the many paper cuts that you lived through, but it was a process for many of us outside of that as a place you were making, a place where things could be seen and heard, and that they existed for both of your work as well. As you talk about the places and spaces that families make through racial and ethnic socialization, through the process of political engagement, through civic engagement, et cetera. So my question, there are lots of different folks in this room. There are students, there are faculty, there are staff, there are people in here who are really into focusing on Asian Americans issues, others who are into mental health, others who are into just supporting all of the different kind of work that comes through from HES. So I was wondering if, given your expertise and work, all of you, how you think and how you hope to continue to kind of make and make and make these places and spaces where we might do this kind of work that reimagines, a more just future.
I'll offer that. I think affinity groups and finding your people is so critical for you to be able to sustain yourself. we had a youth advisory board for our Asian American Youth Project, and the youth reported just never being part of a group where they could talk about research and mental health and all the different things that they were able to do. Schools didn't really provide that. Maybe they had an Asian American club, but not about like mental health and identity. So I think affinity groups, and for myself, finding those groups that I can share with sort of in a text thread and, in everyday life is so critical. But my eyes have been really open to this book that I've been in the middle of reading called The Power of Strangers, and also the importance that if you have your people that you feel safe with, that you should also feel safe enough to approach strangers, which is really odd, right? Because there's stranger danger. Right, like, stranger danger, don't talk to strangers, don't get in a van, right? So that's a reality. But we're also part of many communities, and we cannot just be sort of isolated in our community, because otherwise we won't be able to sort of connect with all the other shared experiences that they might have. And I think about Russell's book and just sort of looking for your people and feeling like a stranger maybe. This book that I've been reading, they say that the author says, everyone's a stranger. So, which I never really thought about myself being a stranger, but I am a stranger to other people. But I would hope to be able to connect with other folks who might be willing to sort of engage with somebody like me that's different than them. So it's a balance of being able to feel safe, but also safe enough to, again, not get in somebody's van, but to sort of meet somebody that
Unless
you
they
just
have
don't
really
know.
good candy.
Unless they have good, yeah, the candy's good. But to sort of be willing to take a risk, safe enough to be able to take a risk. And there is something in developmental theory of, attachment theory, right? Where you feel secure with your caregiver, so secure that you can venture out. And so I do sort of think that that's something that we might want to entertain as well.
Yeah, sorry. I agree entirely with everything that you said, and what has been particularly healing for me are actually cross-racial coalitions and relationships and friendships, and understanding that if we're going to make big structural changes, we really need to work together and keep our eye on the North Star and what is our shared goals, because there are so many forces that try to pull us apart and pit us against each other, and working together for the common good, understanding that the tide, raises all boats, I think has really has given me, in addition to, sort of the more specific groups, and going in and out and of these, various spaces, and working with allies as well, and has really kept me going. But I think that the diversity also in these groups are really important, because sometimes you need different spaces to heal different wounds.
Yeah, I think to reinforce what they just said, I talked about the ways Asians responded to the collective racial trauma. And one thing I always talked about is that when faced by danger, you could go into fight or flight response, right? That's the trauma response. You fight back or you flee. But there's other responses to trauma. And the one I like, and I talk about a lot, is beyond fight or flight, you can flock. So you think about it, right? And if you ever want to see how animals respond to danger, just Google San Diego Zoo earthquake, and you'll see a little video of elephants before humans felt it. They were already gathering in a circle with their baby elephants in the middle, and they were flocking to protect their baby elephants. And then humans felt the earthquake, and they realized that's why they got in the circle, right? So both approaching strangers, working across, you don't have to flock with the same, people like yourself. You could flock with strangers, you could flock across racial alliances. So I think we sort of concur that one way we can keep on building freedom is to continue flocking and to not isolate yourself, but to learn that when we're together, and that's why I keep on talking about the collective, when we're together, we're a lot stronger. And I guess the last thing I would say is, did you guys ever see what's the Netflix, the one about anger?
Beef.
Huh? Beef. Yeah, Beef. Do you guys know about Beef? Yeah, Beef. And there's a line in that, if you haven't seen it, it doesn't matter, but there's a line where the guy has a big beef, he's really angry, and then he said, what is it, Western psychology does not meet the Eastern mind. And that's so true that, again, I think for a lot of Asians, going to therapy may not be comfortable, may not be typical. Our immigrant parents don't think about sharing their secrets to strangers, but there are ways, again, of how our ancestors and our own families have dealt with adversity and racism, and we need to really reclaim them and recover them. So I just encourage you, talk to your parents about how did you overcome this difficulty in your life, and maybe we could learn from them. So you get that socialization from your parents of how they dealt with adversity, and then maybe you could share back to them that upward socialization. Your parents can change too. Your parents can learn too of how you deal with the stress and difficulties of this time. So I think flock together and then learn from each other of how we can deal with it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to open it up now. I don't know if it's probably a loud enough room that people can hear, but if there is also a mic if you need some extra, a little boost. But do we have any questions here for our wonderful panelists?
Any questions? We have about 17 minutes for questions. I think that's a great chunk of time.
Yep.
Questions?
Start you off in the opening. As students ask questions. Thank you so much. You really have offered us so much food for thought. Talking about flocking, I wanted to first share with you an anecdote from pandemic times, and then I'll ask a question. My doctors all happen to be Asian American, not by design, but it just turned out that way. So during the pandemic, I went to the office of one of them, Dr. Hom. It's a very Chinese American practice. His receptionist is also Chinese American. She had always been very reserved. We would just talk about business, right? We never. But during the pandemic, when I went in, she was incredibly voluble. She wanted to share. She asked me, "So, are you okay? I just want to. I want to let you know that I'm getting you into the doctor's office early because when you look like us." Now keep in mind, I'm Indian American, she's Chinese American, right? But she said, when you look like us, you shouldn't be on the subway after 5 p.m. these days because we're targets. And so it was like a whole different way of relating to the receptionist in my doctor's office. It occurs to me, and historians have written about this too, how shared experiences of racial trauma can foster not just bonds of solidarity, but also consciousness of racism that may not have, if you're in denial, for example, right, and model minority, if you're Vivek Ramaswamy, there's no racism. We live in a post-racial society. All of a sudden, on social media, you're attacked like crazy because you're running for governor of Ohio and you suddenly become aware, you discover racism, right? Which leads to a question. You mentioned this model minority mythology, which is so pernicious on so many levels. Not only does it divide, I think, different groups, but within Asian communities, what are the mental health implications? If you're doctors, I think a lot of Asian kids will be accustomed to the teachers, for example, assuming that you must be good in math, or you must want, even if you are interested in art or history or literature. Why, if you want to study history, you're a good student. And you're Asian, so surely you want to be a doctor, surely. So I was just wondering if you could comment on that. And I think Asian parents sometimes are guilty of this too. The sort of expectations that they have of their children can be quite stressful for the kids. So I'm wondering if you could address.
So I think in addition to the stereotypes or the consequences that you talked about with parents and teachers, there's also an assumption that everything is fine until it interrupts with schooling or education. And so there is, and because of cultural barriers towards accessing mental health care or reluctance, so sometimes by the time that that becomes something that has to be done, the severity of the disorder or the problem or the trauma is much greater than it needs to be necessarily. And we hear oftentimes, like in school also, because there's no behavioral issue, then a lot of children go under the radar, because they're not taking up the resources or the attention that the teacher has limited amount of as well. Can you talk about other clinical?
Well, I guess one thing that I'll share is that we have this data that I didn't share on the slides with about 500 12 to 18-year-old Chinese Americans, and one of the biggest disagreements that they have with their parents is on the academic pressures and expectations and so forth. And what's really interesting is the lack of consensus is not about getting good grades. And quite frankly, it's a cultural value. I mean, we're all students. You all should get good grades, right? Like, we should strive for that. It is a cultural value, it's a value of everyone here. So there's no disagreement there. The disagreement is actually, don't put me in a box. Do not assume anything about me. And I think that is a unique sort of U.S. experience. We see that more in the kids who are U.S. born. Do not make me into you or what you want me to be. I get to discover that for myself. So there's a bit of a nuance to that. I do think the model minority myth sort of runs into this cultural value and it's just disagreement. But I don't think that disagreement is about being good at what you're interested in. And I think that's just a product. It is a product of being bicultural. It's also something that parents have a really hard time understanding as well. And I'm a parent. I get that. It's really hard to experience pressure and the hopes of what your parents want you to be. But I think it's just amplified even more for Asian American kids.
For immigrants, right?
The newer immigrants seem to agree more with the parents. It's about, I think it's really like the longer you are, you're in the first generation. Yeah. It's generational. Yeah. We actually see more problems in the U.S. born than the kids. Different outcomes, different problems. But in terms of agreeing with your parents, it's U.S. kids who really have a different view. I think by virtue of the fact that they have different lived experiences and different environments growing up.
Any other question? Comment? I'm so happy I sat behind these students who were taking notes accurately.
They're from my class.
It has to do with Miss Cindy, your study. The last slide that you showed was about how the youth were mostly using AI compared to real life. I was wondering if anything that you didn't put in your study was talking about what was the reason of why the youth were using mostly AI? Was it because of the lack of communication with immigrant parents, which I relate, or is it because AI basically tells you what you want to hear compared to what you don't want to hear?
Yeah.
Great question. Well, guess what? The field right now is so new that you could go and answer that and design a study because there's really very few studies on this. and it worked really hard to find all these data sets. And we have collected some data in almost 100 Fordham University students actually, and asking some of these questions, what makes them better than a therapist or, you know, a family member. And it, you know, again, the data is new, unpublished, and the sample size is small, but as you can maybe speculate, it's really validating, it doesn't judge, right? And so we are so averse to judgment or the potential of judgment that AI just will never judge. And they'll say things that you want to hear, they'll validate you. I mean, with every prompt, they validate you and they say, great point, good question, glad you asked, like, you're smart for coming up with that, right? And so who doesn't love to hear that? I do think that for OpenAI, they did scale back on some of that sort of language, but nonetheless, it's still really reinforcing. Why wouldn't you go back to that, right? So it's speculative, but there have been some responses in our surveys to suggest that the folks are gravitating because of the non-judgmental nature. And the second piece of this is that it's always accessible. So anytime you feel some sort of distress or you feel like a moment of loneliness or maybe you want to unpack something that came up for you and you wonder why that happened and like, was I in the right or wrong for doing that? And you don't want to bother or text your friend because it's like in the middle of the night, you can ask AI, right? I'm not supporting this, by the way, but it is, I guess, a means for how a lot of people are trying to address their issues. As a clinician, what I do think is problematic, I'm not sure the extent to which people have discussed this, is that one thing about therapy and one thing about friends is the therapeutic process works because in between talking with people, you're sort of processing it on your own. And you're sort of holding it together until the next time you see your therapist. And then you work it out. And that's really regulating because you're saying, okay, I'm gonna hang in there and get through it. I gotta get to class, I gotta do all the things I need to do, and then we'll deal with it. That's really regulating, and that's sort of lost actually when you have AI who's always there, right? And so you don't have that sort of tolerance of distress. Distress tolerance, by the way, is a variable that we have in a lot of our surveys. It is the strongest predictor for everything, particularly suicidality. And when I see and get flagged a young person who is suicidal, and so they fill out the survey, they indicate that they have some suicidality. I look at that and then I look at the distress tolerance measure as well, and it's always really low. And so I do think that there's something about being able to sort of tolerate your distress until the appropriate time of dealing with it. With something like AI, that's really lost. And so, but again, these are all things that have come up for me as I've been delving into this world. Yeah, I mean, definitely, there's so much more to be done on that topic. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Other questions? Any other questions here?
I don't think I need the mic. Okay.
For the recording.
Oh, for the recording.
Okay.
Okay.
I'll take it. First of all, I just want to say thank you so much for your talk today. I cite all of you in my dissertation on Asian American racism during COVID, and so it's also a little bit fangirling that celebrities are here for my literature review. But I recognize like the kind of like a key theme I think in your work discussed today is like the vicarious racism, right? And so I've been often thinking about how as an Asian American person who also writes about Asian American racism, how hard it is and how that itself is vicarious racism.
Yeah.
The paper cuts, right? The constant, like reading about it, and that I find myself really struggling sometimes to like put into words how I feel and how I'm interpreting my participants, whether it's quantitative data or qualitative data, like how hard it can be to write about it and other people's experiences. And so I'm wondering from like the researcher perspective and the human experience of like, how do you navigate those times where it becomes really hard to do the work that we do, because it is about ourselves.
Yeah.
They talk to AI.
Don't
She
do
said
that.
not to.
I think Cindy really said this well, like find your people. And so, I mean, during this period when we were intensely doing this work, my lab I made, I strongly encourage all my graduate students, my whole team to actually seek help, like to see, to get some, support in the ways that, and we talked in the ways that they felt most comfortable with. Because you're right, we were, studying about other people's trauma, but we were immersed in it and carrying the fears and concerns that we would be ourselves, targeted as well. And it was very difficult as a group. So we had each other in that way, but we were also processing it, really deeply. And outside of that, I had my Asian American group, colleagues where we would have this text group. We did Zooms together, to get through this period as well. But I think, what you're talking about really is, it really is an issue for folks who do this work. Any other advice?
Yeah, I mean, this hits close to home. I had a student who's violently attacked.
Yeah.
While we were working on paper related to this work, and to take a semester off. It was really bad. So I think I've been a lot more thoughtful about indeed finding people that you can share this with, but I've been a lot more thoughtful about making sure I'm not exposing other people to
Yes.
the crazy memes and crazy news that I see. And there's this tendency to be like, did you see this? Oh my gosh, this is crazy. And the camaraderie around that feels good. Like, hey, we've got this sense of belonging, but is our mental health better for it or not? Right? And this kind of comes back to the distress tolerance that I was referring to is, am I relying too much on my group to deal with my distress and creating more for them? And it's sad because we're in this predicament. We shouldn't be in this predicament, right? Like, it kind of sucks. It's really unfair. But I've been a bit more thoughtful about not spreading that particular way, because I have a tendency to check this out, right? And to know who to do that with and who not to do that with, and so forth. So I've been much more mindful of that.
Apricot guy.
The Beatles song.
Huh?
Sounds like a Beatles song.
Yeah, it's a really good question, but if we don't tell our stories, then who will? And I think Stop the API Hate, we did a survey of the people who reported their hate incidents, and you would think, oh, we report so that we could get legal redress or we could get access resources. But the reason why people reported Stop the API Hate is because we were a trusted community member and they just wanted to share their stories, right? They wanted to have a public platform, to have a voice. And so I think if you have the capacity and have the space and have the shared strength and support of others, then together we should create a public platform to share the pain and the harm that we've been experiencing, so that we're not invisible, but so that we can get justice. And so I think you have to sort of weigh it on the individual level. What capacity, what strengths can I continue with this work? But for some of us who have more privilege or more distance, then we could work together to share the data. So I think, yeah, it depends on each individual has certain capacities of their role in fighting the racism, and I think I'm grateful that it's not just one voice, right, or one data set, but it's collectively, I can't use that word, it was the community coming together to share the story and to address it.
We are out of time, but I want to first say thank you, and I'm reminded my dad, since I was a little girl, he's Japanese American. He always used to say, "We belong to each other." I tell that to my students. We say that in our lab. It actually is reverberating, and from flocking to up socializing to teaching my kids to teach me things constantly, even when I don't want them to, and all the many ways that we do this. So I want to kind of, as you move forth, I'm so glad you all came. We belong to each other in our work, in our communities. I hope you take that forth and that you show up for the really excellent keynote that will be tomorrow as well. And I want to thank these really wonderful folks up here and for coming to be here with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much to all of you. We belong to each other. I'm going to hold on to that.
Yeah.
I want to thank our speakers, not just for sharing their wisdom, but for coming to our college from California, from Boston, from Baltimore, and after a whole day of teaching.
Hey.
Much respect. No, I must say, Russell's been teaching us all day and all day yesterday. So thank you so much. I also want to thank the Department of Psychology for partnering with us. And for the faculty and the students from the Department of Psychology that came. So thank you so much for being with us. And yes, as she said, tomorrow, 11, right here, we'll have Russell Young's Hess Memorial Lecture. Thank you so much. I just want to say, let me emphasize the student part there. I've been so proud of my students. It happens every year. Whenever I get thanks, that happens, especially when I get thanks to our students. But I've seen so many of you repeatedly in these events, many of you joining us. I sit in the back, I watch, you're taking notes, you're learning. And I'm just so incredibly grateful to you for being in this part, this place, and demanding your attention. Thank you.
To students. Thank you. Oh yeah, we should. Can we take a picture?
Yeah.
Let's do it. Christina, can you take a picture of us? Here, I'll take it and then I can send it. Christina's about to defend her brilliant dissertation very soon. So you'll soon hear about her amazing work.